Okay, so for everyone who just joined, welcome to this PractiTest webinar or this practice series webinar around communication skills for testers. My name is Joel and I'm Practice Chief Solution Architect, and I'm going to be your host on today's session. So thank you very much for joining. Before we get started, I want to basically go over what we want to cover today. So today's session is going to be, as I mentioned, around communication. And I want to start first and foremost by explaining or trying to get a common ground on what do I mean by communications. So I'm going to be talking about that. Then I want to explore a little bit about typical testing communications or the typical communications that we're going to be seeing around our testing teams. And then I want to move forwards over what might be the heart of this session. And this is a concept that I have been developing in the last months around the 4 levels of the communication model within testing. And again, a little bit about communication and career path and Q&A. So in and out, it should be around 45 minutes to an hour. And again, let's actually, before we get started also, just a short introduction about myself. So who am I? That's actually a great question. If I look into my professional profile, I've been in testing for about 20 years. I started fresh out of college. Even during my last 2 years in college, I started as a tester in a couple of software startups. I moved to the role of QA manager in a number of companies, large and small. And after a number of years doing that, then I started being a blogger, a consultant in testing, speaking a little bit about testing in multiple conferences. And today I have the role of solution architect, and that is related to testing because I'm actually PractiTest solution architect. And as my roles in PractiTest basically, and this is also where the information for this session comes, I am very much in touch with many of the companies who are actually using our system. And I get to spend a lot of time talking to them and to analyzing and understanding the way that they work. And I actually get a lot of information from what they're doing. And in addition to that, I also manage the operations, the QA operations within PractiTest. That's also a role that I like doing. And so I'm trying to stick to it as much as I can. Very brief introduction about PractiTest. I'm not going to try to sell you anything, but just to give you background info. PractiTest it's an ALM solution, a SaaS or hosted ALM solution. It's actually a pretty good one. If you're not aware of it, or you haven't tried it, do suggest you go ahead and try it. We have a free trial that you can actually work with. It's very simple, intuitive. On the other hand, we try to make it incredibly flexible and fit for professional teams, meaning if you're doing professional testing, it's not only clicking buttons, then this is the tool for you. Pretty easy to integrate it with tons of stuff from Jira to Selenium, Jenkins, Pivotal Tracker, QTP, again, almost any tool. We have a pretty nice integration with Slack that we released not so long ago. Pretty good tool. And one of the things that I'm most proud of, I believe that we have the best support in the system, and I do challenge you to use it. It's not only about helping you with the tool, it's helping you with your methodology and basically being there in order to help you out in any way we can. Okay, so again, if you haven't tried it, obviously I suggest you go ahead and work with it. But again, that's the last that you're going to hear from that. And let's actually switch over to the topic of our conversation. By the way, something I forgot to mention, you can ask questions during the session itself. We will have a Q&A section towards the end. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to answer those questions during the session, but I'll be happy to towards the end of the presentation. Okay, now let's get started. And as I mentioned, I want to start the session, I think, by trying to draw a common ground on what do I mean when I talk about communication. And again, going back to college and the ways that we used to define communication in college, I believe that every communication event is actually going to be defined by 4 main components. By the way, they're a little bit different from the components that I learned in college. And again, it comes from my analysis of the world today. And I believe that the most important goal, the most important component is going to be the goal of our communication. Okay, what do we want to achieve by it? And I'm going to be talking quite a lot about it today. Second component is going to be the players. Okay, we usually have one sender. That's the person starting the communication. We have either one or many receivers of that communication. Not less important is going to be the channel. By the channel, we mean, if you go into the formal definitions of communication, the encoding, the medium, and the decoding of the communication. And obviously, there's the message. By the way, if you want to go to the formal definition, most people talk about the feedback loop. And I just include that within the channel itself. Okay, but those are the goals of communication and the components that actually define it. When most people think about communication, they think about something that looks like this. Okay, and let's take an example. This is me communicating with my wife, and you see me here, and you see my wife over there. And you can see that we have here, these are the players, the channel. You can see it in here, the coding and coding. And the message I'm not going to tell you. You can ask my wife what I told her. But that's how people tend to see communication. They tend to see it very straightforward, very simple. I say this say that. And you know what? That might be one case. But in my experience, most times when we talk about communication, it actually looks more like this. Okay? Communication is usually carried out when one person is trying to broadcast to many other people. There's usually a lot of noise in the room, a lot of people trying to compete for the attention of that receiver. If I'm the sender, then it's going to be competing for the attention of that receiver or multiple receivers. There's going to be many communication events taking place at the same time, and it's actually very, very messy. Okay, and if you try to think even not even about a political rally, and that's obviously for those of you in the US and many of you in Europe, that's very relevant today. But even if you think about your project, when you're trying to pass information along to someone, then there's obviously going to be other people trying also to get their attention, to tell them stuff. And it's not going to be something straightforward. So we're not going to be talking about you and your wife passing messages or your partner, passing messages freely. It's going to look a lot more messy like this. Now, if communication in principle, it's a messy thing, then there needs to be things that we can do in order to make it less messy or at least more efficient if we want. And I want to talk about a concept called communication alignment. Okay? Communication alignment means taking many of the things that you're going to be doing around the communication and trying to align them in order to make your communication more effective. Okay, so if I'm going to start by focusing on the goal of my communication, and again, I'm going to go into that. What do I want to achieve? Meaning me as a tester, I want to achieve something, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a couple of minutes, but it's not always the goal that I want to achieve. It's not always to tell people what's the status of the application. It's many times that's the case, but it's not always like that. And we need to think about our goals, okay? And if we think about our goal and we start focusing on that part of our goal, then the first thing that we need to do is we need to understand very clearly what do we want to achieve, okay? By what do we want to achieve, it's usually a change in the current status of something. And to give you an example, if you're going to be reporting a bug, obviously you want to modify that bug and to make it fixed. If you're going to be reporting, let's say, test cases and the status of those test cases around the specific area of the product, it might be because you want more developers to be stabilized in that area. If you're going to be communicating timelines, it might be because you want people to move that release date because it's not achievable. So try to understand what do you want to achieve. Once you have that clear, then the next phase is going to be to define who is actually going to be sending and receiving the message. Sending is usually you or your team. Maybe you're going to be empowering someone to do it. You need to understand who's the best person, the most adequate, and who will be able to send that, obviously depending on who's going to be receiving that message. Okay, and it's usually not going to be one person. It's usually going to be a lot of people in there. And the last thing that we need to consider, it's also what channel should we use. So understanding what do we want to achieve, knowing who's going to be carrying out that message from who to whom. Then you want to understand that you have multiple channels that you can use and which is going to be the most effective one, which is going to be the one that is going to be more aligned in order to help you carry out this communication. And again, going over a bug that you want to fix, what you want to achieve is that bug being fixed, and you have a couple of ways of doing that. You can either send an email to the developers who are going to be fixing that, and to the manager and to the CEO of your company, send in an email that is very formal, Or maybe the best way to go about it is just to go knock on the developer's cube and say, hey, Charlie, do you know what? There's this bug that is very annoying. Maybe you can fix it. So this is using different um, receivers and using different channels in order to achieve the same type of communication. And always think and realize that there's always more than one way of doing something. By the way, talking about the same bug that you want to fix, sometimes it's not you that should go and ask this person to fix that bug. Think about someone in your team who's more friendly with that person. And I know that we've all done it. So think even about that. What do you want to do in order to make that change happen? Okay. And again, we're still talking about communication. Now, moving forwards, and up to now, I have been talking on a very theoretical realm. What I want to do right now is to use or to bring you up on part of the things that I've seen as part of my investigation, as part of my interaction with many testing teams and talking to colleagues about what's happening in their organizations and what they know. And these are the next two sections of today's webinar. The first part, or what we're going to be talking about now, I want to try to talk about the typical testing communication, meaning what type of communication is the one that we're seeing in most testing teams. And obviously, I'm going to be generalizing, and that's bad, but it's going to help us to drive a point home. Okay, if we look into the typical things that we communicate as testers, then we're going to be seeing that it's going to be centralized along these 6 points that we see in here. Okay, if we start from the top and we talk about the bugs that we have in here. So as I mentioned, we're going to be having communication around bugs. We're going to be talking about bugs. What do we have in there? What did we expect to find? What didn't we expect to find? We're going to be talking about stuff like that. Moving counterclockwise, we may start seeing people who talk about test results. Okay, so I ran this test and these are the results that I got, or I ran that test and this is what I found. You can look into a little bit more complex communication and say that we're going to be seeing a lot of people talking about testing summary reports. And this is okay. So analyzing the stuff that I was able to see, then this is what I actually found in my testing. And this is what I think that is wrong in there. Some other teams will actually also bring up status updates or status reports. You see them in multiple formats. You may see them as emails that are sent. You may see them as weekly meetings. You may see them as dashboards, but it's still the same. You're updating on the status. You can even see some testing teams that are in charge of at least putting together the release notes. These are the bugs that are in there that we should actually make the whole world aware of them. These are the things, the limitations that we need to talk about. And again, still talking about the general or the typical testing communication, maybe the higher end of it is going to be what I called in here testing recommendations. And that is, if we look into what we found on this project overall during the postmortem or the retrospective, this is what we think should be done differently. This is what we recommend based on those tests. Now, there's a very common denominator in here. If we look into the goals of what we want to do here, all of these goals are based on the product that we're doing, so maybe a little bit based on the process that we're doing. And all of this is good and fine. Again, this is the bread and butter of what we do day in, day out. But it doesn't actually help us to advance the testing team as a whole. And that is something that I'm going to be touching more and more as we move along this process. I want to ask a question here. And again, this is not a question that I want you to answer. This is a question that I want you to think about. I guess that most of the people in this session today are testers. As a tester, what is your professional objective today? Okay, and I want you to think about it for 10 seconds. Think about, what do you want to change? Meaning you're a tester, you're a professional tester, and what is it that you want to modify? I've actually asked this question countless of times to more testers than I care to think about. Most people, what they want to do is they want to be better tester professionals. They want to be better appreciated by their teams, not their testing teams, but their development teams, their organizations. They want to feel that they provide more value. If we think about one of the biggest things that generate anguish on testers is the fact that they believe that, again, developers create the code, product are defined in the product, salespeople generate sales, but us as testers, we create bugs. Maybe we test the software, but we don't really produce a lot of things. And that is something that actually gets people very frustrated. Okay, testers very frustrated. So if our goal as testers, or as at least on many of those testers, is actually to be perceived as better testing professionals, how do these communication operations that we're doing is actually helping us to achieve that goal? Okay, and this takes me actually to what I see is today's the main issue with testing communication. And the main problem that we have today with testing communication is that as testers, we don't understand that there are plenty of additional goals we can achieve by using correct communication techniques. Okay, if we utilize communication better, we're going to be able to achieve other goals, and not only the goals of, okay, finding all the bugs in the product, but also advancing our goals as testers. In a sense, we limit communications today, or many of us are limiting communications today to simply updating everyone on, hey, this is the status of our testing, instead of achieving a lot of additional goals. And it's not only egoistical goals for me, it's not only feeling that I'm better, it's actually providing more value to my organization. Okay, I'm going to be talking a lot more about that. But in a nutshell, my feeling today, and this is something that I've actually been able to review and analyze with a lot of teams, is that communication might be the most important tool that we have as a tester, but it's also the less utilized tool that we have in there. Talking about that, then I want to take us to the next point, and this is an analysis that I've made with some colleagues on what I've been calling the 4 levels of testing communication. Okay? Now, these 4 levels are as follows. I believe that the first level of communication is something that I like to call the over-the-wall communication. Okay, this is the simplest type of communication, basically, and again, we're going to go over each one of them more in detail shortly. After over-the-wall communication, or one level up from over-the-wall communication, then we have what I like to call learning communication. If we take learning communication and we actually give it a step higher than what we had in there, then we will have what I like to call investigative communication. Okay. And the highest level in communication that I've seen today in testing team and the most successful testing teams is going to be what I call constructive communication. Okay. Now, if we try to analyze level by level, and let's start with the first one. If we talk about over-the-wall communication, it can be very much explained by this drawing here. It's basically taking information, throwing it up the wall, and hoping that it reaches the other side. If you think about it, and again, I'm going to make a reference. Think about those old war movies where the hero actually takes a hand grenade, he pulls the plug up, throws the grenade up the wall, and just hides and hopes that everything actually happens okay. And after a couple of seconds, he hears a big boom and hope that everything actually happens okay. So this is the over-the-wall communication that I'm talking about. And sadly enough, this is the most common communication that we actually see in testing. Oops, sorry, wrong slide. This one here. Now, examples of over-the-wall communications are many of the ones that I mentioned previously. Bug reports or bug lists that I'm going to be sending and sharing with my team. Testing results or testing reports that I'm going to be sharing. Update presentations or emails. Sessions when I just go and say, hey, this is what's going on, or the sky is falling, or we're not going to be able to release the stuff. So these are the type of communication exercises that I'm talking about. Their objective is basically to help stakeholders with their tactical decisions. We want this and this bug to be fixed. We want this and this test to be rerun. We believe that these areas are the most problematic. We want more developers being injected into those areas in order to fix them. It's very, very tactical in nature. These are things that we're going to be changing right now. Their characteristics, if we come here, it's a fire and forget. If you think about a mortar or a grenade, again, you just fire it, forget about it, and hope that it does the work You're not going to be doing anything else. They're very dry and very fact-based. You're saying, hey, these are the bugs that are in there. I didn't put them in there. I didn't classify them. This is what they are. Go and fix them. And it's a one-size-fits-all. If we're talking about customizing communication channels, it's definitely not this. We're broadcasting our bugs. We're telling everyone this is the status of the application, and whatever you want to do with that, go ahead and do it. The biggest problem with this type of communication, at least in my mind, is that in an essence, we're actually not providing any new information, or we're not actually helping the team here. You may say, hey, I'm reporting the bugs. How come that's not new information? Well, the first time you report the bug, or whenever you tell the world that the bug is there, then you are actually providing new information. But to be real, you're going to be talking about the same bug time and time again, and you're going to be adding it into many, many reports, and you're going to talk about the same bug at least 20 times. So one time is going to be new, 19 times it's not going to be new. Because you're doing the same thing time and again, and I don't see a lot of people who, whenever they report a bug, are also saying, hey, this is the way that you should fix it. Then you're basically saying, no, you have here an issue. Go ahead and do something about it. And it enrages more people than it helps, especially if you're going to be repeating that time and time again. Think about the last bug review meeting you were. Think about 90% of the bugs that you talked about that people are saying, yes, we know about them, let's move forwards. Okay, this is the type of information, this is the type of issues that we're running into. So think about how effective you're going to be on trying to make yourself a more valuable player in your team if the only thing that you're actually doing is providing the same information time and time again. If this is the case, then what can you do about it? Well, it's very simple. You can start actually moving forward in additional levels of communication. And let me give you a couple of ideas. So if we go over to our next level, and talking here about what I call learning communication, then we're talking here about a little bit different things, okay? What we do when we're working in learning communication, and I want to start with our objective, it's basically to get a better understanding of the AUT and to create awareness of testing in other teams, such as the development team and the product team. What are we doing in there? And again, going in a different way, let's go over some examples of that. So whenever you actually get your team to participate in requirements review meetings or design review meetings, many times you're going to be quiet in there. But again, sometimes you will be able to participate as well. So being part of those meetings, having one-on-one meetings with your developers or even with your product team, where you can ask more questions, where you can go more in depth into what you should be doing in there, getting not only, again, the stuff that can be written, but the more insight into what's going on in there. Even having review sessions and work sessions with other testing teams, maybe of products that are going to be interacting with your own product. So all of these are what I call learning communication. Now, some people may say, hey, this is not a communication, this is actually a meeting. But if you think about it, if your objective is, first of all, to get better understanding of your application under test, and if your objective is to get more information, but also to make sure that your developers and your product team is more aware about what you're going to be doing in testing, then you are communicating information in here as well. It's not a direct communication, but it's a very, very effective type of communication. Now, what basically help us to understand what this type of communication does is that it's basically an inbound communication channel. If during the previous level we were talking about providing information, on this level we're actually trying to get information. But as we get information, as we ask those questions, as we have that conversation with developers and product, we're also providing them information. So it's not a simple one way, but it's mainly an inbound conversation. It is around concrete and simple information about your products and your risks. But once you actually engage those stakeholders in that conversation, then you actually are getting them to think more highly about what you're doing. So it's not about coming and say, hey, what should I test? It's about saying, okay, so there's this new feature, let's analyze it together. Which are the risks that we have in there? Looking into the stuff that happened before, what can we actually test better? Okay, so try to get that type of conversation, professional conversation with them. Try to do your homework, try to learn as much as you can from the written stuff. And when you get in there, ask the more interesting questions. Now, what this does, and this is the third point that we have in here, For many developers and many product managers, this is the first time that they're going to be able to see what the testing process is about. Even if you're not going over every test that you're going to be doing, you're going to be introducing them into your testing process and providing them more information into what you're actually doing. Okay, so again, it's mainly an inbound communication channel, but it's also providing them a lot of information about what you're doing. Now, the good and the bad about this type of communication. This is your first step to get more information from additional stakeholders. This is one way of getting more out of what you already have in there. But many times, because you're talking about developers and product teams who are not aware of what you're doing, who might not be very interesting, then these people may get to miss a little bit about what they could have gotten out of you. Meaning, you won't be able, because you're actually trying to ask them for information, not everyone's going to be interested into what you actually can teach them. Okay, so that's one of the things that might be a bad point of this communication, but it's actually mostly good. If you get actually to get that conversation started, one of the first things that I get to see a lot in teams who are on this learning level of communication is a very nice effect that the next time that the application is going to be modified, then testers are going to be updated live. Why? Because if I was talking to a developer about one feature and we went over it very, very deeply and he believes that now I understand it correctly, if he knows that that feature was modified right now, he will come proactively and tell me, hey, this was modified. Go ahead and learn more about it. You might want to know this and this and this. He knows I'm involved in there, and he will come to me more whenever he hears that I may have more information to gain from that. Okay, so take that into account. It will actually bring you one step forwards into the way that those developers actually look at you. Okay, you're not a tester that takes the application blindly and presses some buttons. You're actually doing some investigations beforehand. Now, there are plenty of other examples, and I'll be happy to talk with additional people about them, but let's actually move forward, so I don't want to spend too much time on here. I want to leave time for Q&A. The next level of communication is what I tend to call investigative communication. It's more about the investigation, taking it a step deeper. Okay, and it may sound a little bit weird at once, but let's talk about it. In here, I'm talking about teams and testers who take their investigation a step deeper. If you have a support team, one of the best ways of getting more information and very interesting information is to go with them and analyzing their support tickets. Where did the bugs came from? Those bugs that actually were reported by your customers outside. Try to understand what areas are more problematic or less problematic. Obviously, if you think about a couple seconds, these are the places where you didn't test right the previous time, so you want to test better these times. You may also want to think about meeting your pre-sales team or your technical sales team. These guys are actually neck deep with your users when they're actually setting up their products and working with their products. So they have a lot of information. Operating systems, configurations, what's relevant? What actually happens? How hard is it to install and configure the system? How do they train the people? What's hard to understand or easier to understand? What features do people ask for? Those are the features that if you're actually going to be delivering right now, you want to test them very, very deeply. All of that second and third level information that you may get from people who are actually closer to the problems and closer to the fields, you want to get that information, and it's not trivial to get it. Other examples of investigations that you can do, try to work with anyone in your team in order to generate personas or user profiles. Try to work with your team in order to understand your competition, their profiles. How does their application look like? Okay, all of these are investigations that you can do in order to have even a better testing approach. An additional thing that might be a little bit separate from these first four examples is this fifth example, and I want to pay special attention to it. This is when you can actually go to your higher management and have sessions with them where you can ask them, hey, Mr. CTO, Mr. CIO, Mr. VP Sales, what information do you need in order to decide whether you want to release the product or not? What's important? Meaning these guys are going to be seeing the world from the eyes of business. Maybe the most important thing is that these three features are good and the rest, they don't really care. It's okay. We need to release this product in this quarter. Why? Because the competition is killing us. Or maybe these guys are going to be telling you something else altogether. It's like, hey, we released a very unstable feature last time. First and foremost, let's make sure that we get it right this time. So try to talk about these guys in order to understand what's important for them. I'm going to be talking about why this is problematic in it by itself, but this is another type of investigation, and this is especially important not in those small companies where you have maybe 30, 40 people, and it's very easy for you to knock on the door of your CEO or your VP sales and say, hey, Mike, it's Joe out of testing, and I have these questions. It gets more interesting when you're working in a larger organization where you have 500 or 5,000 people, and you actually get to talk to someone who will be making those decisions. Maybe it's going to be your VP product, and try to understand what's important for them. But again, it's the bigger your organization, the more complex the decision to release a product, the more interesting it becomes. Now, as I mentioned before, you have a couple of objectives on this type of communication. The first one, the simpler one, is to get the more complex information on what do you want to test on your AUT. Now, most times you're going to be getting information that is not trivial for your development and your product team, meaning you will be that guy who comes in during the meeting and says, hey, but this bug is important because when I talked to my support team, they said that this and this and this actually was very hard for them. Okay, or when I was talking to my pre-sales, they were saying that this and this strategic customer is actually using that operating system, and it's very important for us to support it correctly. Okay, so think about that type of information, that you're going to be that person providing it from now on. And the other objective of it, it's going to be, and again, if I go back into talking to higher management, to try to understand if there is any type of specific information you can provide them that will help them to make the correct decisions. One of the things that you see in organizations where testing is very appreciated, it's not testing that is appreciated, it's a specific test manager or a specific test director or a specific tester that is very appreciated. And this is the guy that whenever the CEO is running around or going around the cubicles, he will knock on the cubicle on Jake's cube and say, hey, Jake, how are you? What are you testing right now? It is because this guy was the one who provided that person that information that he needed. And you want to be that person, basically. Now, their characteristics, if we go a little bit deeper into that, we're actually talking about two-way communication channels. And the reason for that is because, and again, from experience and from talking to many, many people, whenever you start talking to your support people, your pre-sale people, they will have more questions than they will have answers for you. Hey, what are you testing? Hey, how do you do it? Hey, when you're testing, do you do this and this and this? So expect to get a lot of questions. Expect to be able to provide a lot of additional information. These guys are really curious on what's actually going on in the development, and most times this person's actually not allowed to understand a lot what's going on in the development, and they're going to be using your position within your development team in order to provide that information. It will give you tons of additional ideas, not necessarily related to functionality. This is very important. This is about non-functional parts of your project or your process, but it's also very useful. Oops, sorry. And again, you're going to be surprising people. So at least the first time that you do it, know that you're going to be surprising them. And again, surprises are good in that case. But again, they won't expect you to be there at the beginning. They won't understand what you want from them. So try to help them out in there. The good and the bad, and he already talked about that, it provides us a lot of valuable information from real life users. Okay, all of a sudden you will be an authority within the development saying, hey, this and this is important because I talked to this and this guy. And again, without naming any names, this big bank or that large airline actually is very dependent on that feature. It will awake the interest from additional stakeholders into your testing process. Even if you're going to be talking to your support, even if you don't necessarily talk to your CEO, more people will have additional interest in your testing, and that's a good thing. But as I mentioned before, in many organizations, people don't like noise. Meaning, if I'm managing the development process, I don't want the noise from support saying, go ahead and fix this quickly, or make sure that you do this and this and this for that customer. I want to try to leave that noise outside of my team. And so something that I've seen tens of times, if not hundreds of times, when developer directors, development managers start understanding that you're actually going outside of the family to talk about what's going on within the family, they tend to get mad. Whenever you start going to your CTO or your VP R&D and telling them information and asking questions, these guys are going to be very, very afraid. And if you think about it, and we're talking here about communication, we're talking here about information. Organizations, specifically large organizations, information is power. And if you're trying to create a direct channel to people who are higher in the organization, who are higher on the hierarchy, your managers don't want to see that happening because they want to have, for good and bad, control over what information is going to be passing to them. And so expect to get, in the best of cases, people looking at you weirdly. On the worst of cases, and this has happened to me. Again, it was many years ago, but a VP R&D came, or actually a director of R&D came and told me, I don't want you to talk to the CEO anymore. All that information should pass through me. And I'm going to tell you the truth. I stopped doing that. And it was dumb for myself to do it. I should have continued talking to that CEO because we were having a good conversation and I was providing that person a lot of information he wanted to get. But because I was afraid of my director of R&D, I stopped talking to the CEO directly. And it was because that person, for good and bad, he wanted to have control over what information passed along. Okay, and I don't believe he was right. Today, looking back 17 years into my bag, then I guess I should have acted differently. But expect to have that type of rejections from people. Now, the last level of information that we have in here is what I call constructive communication. And constructive communication, as its names actually explains, it's more about building things together, communication that actually creates things. And in here, a couple of examples is, and I really like this, and I've seen more and more people doing that, pair testing sessions with development teams. Go ahead and do that same type of pair testing session with support engineers as well. The idea of pair testing sessions is to get more out of your testing, and you can do it by working with different people. It doesn't necessarily need to be testers or developers. Test planning workshops with representatives from different teams. And by workshops, I mean, okay, getting everyone together for a day or two, have people from development, from support, from product, from sales, and say, hey, this is what I want to test. Give me feedback. Let's plan this actually together. And another thing that I believe it's very constructive, it's something that I try to do in every organization that I work at, and that is to make sure that every person on the testing team and as many developers as possible are able to go ahead and visit customers directly. Go ahead and see your user, see how he or she works. If they're working with an iPhone, go ahead and see how people outside of the real world actually use your apps. If you're talking about an enterprise application, travel to those enterprise users and see how they're working. If you cannot do that, then I'm sure that your company has CABs. CABs is customer advisory boards. This is where they take your more influential customers, and you can actually go there and talk to them and try to get as much information as possible. Again, you're trying to construct, to build something. The idea here is to share information, but also to get involvement, okay? You want to get as many people as possible involved in your testing, in whatever you're actually doing. Once you actually get them involved, under the assumption they're actually doing something good, then you're going to get recognition for the value that you're bringing. Okay, you're going to start getting recognition because you're generating personas that are going to be helping both your testing and your developers create a better product. You're actually getting more information into what's really important. You're stopping the rejections on support from happening, even from your developers. You're going to be getting your users happier because they feel that they're more interrelated into what's happening. And I've done this at least in 4 different companies on my own, meaning go and talk to those users. They want to help. They want to be part of your development team. They expect to be getting something out of it, meaning better features, maybe access to the system faster, maybe being able to be part of that design team. But you get them more involved and they're going to be happier customers. And if these are strategic customers for your companies, you're actually doing your company a favor for that. The characteristics, again, if we go into that, then this is, as you can actually see, a two-way communication channel. You're asking and you're getting, and people are asking and getting at the same time. This is one place where you feel good about doing it both with internal and external players, maybe within your team, maybe within your company. It does require a lot of advanced skills, both of communication and group management. If you're going to be doing a workshop, you want to have someone who knows how to manage a workshop. Okay, if you're going to be doing Again, talking to customers, you need to know how to talk to a customer. You need to know how to behave, how to dress, how to talk to them, how to write an email. It's not something that is trivial, but I'm sure that you can get help in your company in order to do it. And again, it's a skill that you can develop. Okay, and we'll be talking about that skill soon enough. And if we talk about the good and the bad of this type of communication, this is the one that generates a lot of recognition on the value of testing, because all of a sudden you have a lot of people internally and externally understanding how you test a product. You have a lot of people who actually know what questions they can come and ask you. If you're going to be talking with the support, then they can get a lot of information before the product is released. I remember one company where we had support testing before, learning how to work around many of the issues that we're going to be releasing, and they created those support guidelines before the product was released, and it was great. Because during those first weeks that used to be chaos because no one knew how to work with the product, these guys actually had hands-on experience with it. The same goes for salespeople. If you have those guys who need to go ahead and install those disks whenever they arrive at the customer, then this will be a great way of getting them to know how it works. Take into account, though, this is a long-range gain. You're going to be doing a lot of short-range investments. You're going to be working a lot with people, but the gain's going to come on a longer range in here. Okay, and one of the interesting things is if we go back, just a second, if we go back over to the communication model, notice that at the same time you may be working with different types of communications, but the important thing is how do you manage to actually utilize it together, coming from below and all the way up, in order to make your communication strategy a little bit better. Okay, now let me take you over, and we have just one last point to talk about, and that is before we actually move to Q&A, and I'm getting here signs that we need to move to Q&A quickly, and that is the relationship between your communication and your career path. And analyzing the type of companies that we've seen, then we see something like this. And let me try to explain this graph a little bit. What we tend to see is that as the maturity of the team, the maturity of the tester actually becomes better and higher, then we also see how the level of communication that this person has in testing actually becomes higher. Okay? And it might seem trivial, but it's important to realize it. The more experience you have, the more you have grown as a tester, the more comfortable you will be actually working in here as a tester. And what's less trivial, and this is something we actually did by going and talking to people who were not part of the testing team, was that we saw that as the level of communication in testing actually grew, the perception of added value, because again, you cannot provide a number, but the perception that these people had and that these teams had of the added value that they provided actually grew as well. The people who were communicating on the higher levels were appreciated by their teams better, by their developers, by their peers, saying, hey, this guy's actually a great professional. I've worked with many testers and these are the best ones. Or, well, I've worked with other people who actually have better testing skills. What tends to help a lot, it's not only how many Selenium test cases you write or how many load testing actually you're doing, it's also how you're able to communicate here. And in here, I want to take you over so that we understand this even better to another case. Try to think in your company, maybe try to think throughout your past, not necessarily in your testing teams. Try to think about those guys that you work with, your peers, and try to think specifically about those who were appreciated as being better professionals. Obviously, these guys had to generate value by their actions, but many times you're going to be seeing a very good correlation to the way that these guys were able also to communicate what they were doing. These were the guys that when they entered the meeting or when they started speaking at a meeting, people quiet down and they want to hear what they had to say. These were the guys that whenever they entered the room to talk to a manager, the manager didn't push them out and say, hey, I'm busy. Okay? It doesn't mean that these were the guys who spoke the most. I actually know some pretty interesting professionals, not necessarily in testing, who don't talk almost at all, but whenever they open their mouths, people just keep quiet because they know something smart's going to come out of it. But those are the type of people who you listen to because they actually provide a more professional, a better level of communication all around. Okay? Now I want to move over to Q&A, but before we actually do that, I want to summarize today's talk, and I want to summarize in the following points. First of all, communication is a complex mechanism, okay? It's not as simple as one person talking to another and saying only nice things. It's a very complex system. Remember, it's a broadcasting system where you have people fighting for the attention of others and messages that contradict each other and objectives and goals that are not always trivial. Talking about goals, there are many goals that testers don't even try to achieve via correct communication. If I want to be perceived as a better tester, if I want to get more involvement in my product, if I want to be able to be part of those meetings where they make the real decisions, it's always about communication. If you're able to communicate better, if you're able to align your goals to your communication channels, you're going to be able to achieve that better. As I hope I was able to show you, there are actually a number of levels of communications that you can use. And hopefully, if you use them smartly, you will be able to advance your goals. Okay, advance yourself, advance your goals. You will be able to do them correctly. And last but not least, the better you're able to use your communication skills and your communication methodologies, the higher the perception of value that you will bring to yourselves and to your teams. If you're able to communicate better, you will be appreciated better. If you're able to achieve those goals of communication, of being that person who provides the good information at the right time, who is able to get the good information at the correct time, you're going to be providing a more elevated sense of value to your team and to yourselves. Okay, so this actually brings me to the Q&A part of the session, and let's actually go over the questions. Now, if anyone, I see some questions in here, so if anyone has any additional questions, please go ahead and ask them, and I'm actually going to start from the ones that I already see here. The first question is about communication techniques, and this person is actually asking if we should stop talking about bugs and tests, and if we should focus on other things, and what are those other things. And I do want to make this clear. If I said at the beginning, I'm trying to go to the specific slide. When I mentioned that these are the typical testing communication messages that we're seeing outside, I do not mean to say that we should actually stop working with them. These are very important things. Again, we're here in order to test the system. Testing is our main tool. Okay, so we need to test and we need to provide the results. We need to report the bugs effectively. We need to make sure that those bugs are prioritized correctly, which are the ones that need to be done. We need to be able to provide visibility into the product. Okay, so for that, we need those update statuses and stuff like that. But we don't need to limit ourselves to that. Okay, we should be able to achieve higher goals, to have better goals. And for that, we actually need to use additional communication. So it's not about stopping to report the bugs. If you don't report the bugs, then who's going to be reporting those bugs, basically? But it's about how do you actually manage to provide that information and additional information that will actually make more value for you and for your team. And again, I'm not thinking that if you provide more value to yourself, you will be providing less value for your team. Okay, I'm going to move to another question here. This is a cool one. How do I know if I'm a good communicator or not? I guess that you know. You know if people like to talk to you, you know if people come to you for information, you know if when you start talking, people actually pay attention to what you're doing or they immediately pick up their phones and start sending messages. That's one thing. But the best way of knowing if you're a good communicator is if you're able to achieve your goals. Meaning, if you have a goal and that is to make sure that an area of your product will get more coverage. Does it happen when you're communicating correctly? If it doesn't, then it is because you're not aligning. And again, if we come, here, you're not aligning your, no, actually it's, sorry. You are not aligning what you want to do, so you're not communicating correctly. So try to know how to communicate, and There are professionals about it. There are multiple blogs about how to communicate better. But in the end, is to knowing who you're talking to, understanding what's the best way to talk to, and try to find out what's the best way of getting them to do what you're actually asking them to do. Okay, there are a couple of additional questions here. There's a good one here. Any tip for testing communication in Agile groups? These are a great question, but it's actually one that I'm trying to think about it. I don't want to say that it's trivial, but it's very, very important to understand it correctly. Agile development and Agile testing actually revolves around communication. And remember when I was saying that one of the biggest, let me just go, wait a second, trying to find the correct slide in here. When I talked about this slide and I said that many times we don't provide any new information that really helps, this is especially true on Agile teams. On Agile teams, most times, whenever you find a bug, for example, you will communicate it directly to your developer and he will fix it in there. So there's not a lot of value on just talking about bugs all the time. So in Agile, communication is one of the most important parts. On the other hand, when you're doing Agile, then that basically means, and again, given the fact that if we assume that you're doing Agile correctly, that means that you're talking to your developers very much. That means that you're already on the second and third level of communication all around, because you're already doing those review sessions with them. You're already doing that pair testing sessions with them. So you already should be doing very good communication. So try to think about how can you make it more natural in Agile teams to work directly with your developers and not being afraid of communicating with them. Asking those questions, being part of the conversation, and making sure that you're in every place where those decisions are being made. Communication is going to start by, first of all, learning, listening and learning. And once you learned enough, you will be able to also provide out of your knowledge into it. Okay, so for testers transitioning to Agile, one of my biggest suggestions is always to tell them, enter every meeting and be quiet. And after a couple of meetings, you will know when you can speak. But don't be afraid of being at that meeting and don't be afraid of keeping quiet, okay? You can learn a lot from that. Another very interesting question here, and we have tons of them. How do you increase effective communications with offshore teams? A part of the testing process requiring testing from different components and products and changes with internal and external teams, either offshore or onshore. How do you collaborate on efforts of effective communications with offshore teams with different time zones, for example, USA and India? You may not want or like the question that the answer that I'm going to be providing you, but one of the most important parts about working with offshore is being able to travel. There is a misconception that if you're working with an offshore team, you don't need to know the people outside. And I'm being told that we have about 2 more minutes. You don't really know the people outside, but you need to know them. In order to communicate correctly, you need to understand the people who you're going to be working with. So one of the things that I always do whenever I start working with offshore teams on long-term projects is to make sure that the stakeholders from both teams are going to be traveling. For example, I manage teams in Israel, India, Russia, and the US. So we made sure to have exchanges for 1 week or 2 weeks of engineers, of managers going over to the other sites to make sure that they understand how to talk to others. It's a cultural thing. It's a thing of having lunch together with them and understanding what's the best way, the cultural way, how to do it. And another thing is, again, to try to have as many conference calls and calls as much as possible. And whenever you do a conference call, try to make it a video call. Okay, try to see their faces and again, talk not only about business, but also about their lives. I have room for one more question. And I guess I want to take this very general question. How do you improve communication as a whole? You improve communication as a whole by understanding what do you want to achieve with your communication. Okay, and again, I want to go back to this last slide. You want to understand what do you want to achieve with your communication. You want to understand what's your objective, who are you going to be communicating with, and what's the most effective way of doing it. Remembering always that communication is not only about sending the bugs that you have, it's also about learning new stuff. and generating change to other people who are going to be working with you. Okay, how do you improve communication? You start communicating. You set up goals, you achieve your communication with them, and you make sure to continue moving forward. And again, always to ask people, how can you do things better? Okay, guys. So I'm being told that this is everything that we have time for today. So one last thing in here. Um, you can always reach me. This is my personal email, joel@practice.com. Again, this is my email. So any email that you send in there, I will be more than happy to help you with it. Okay, if you want to talk about something, let me know. You can also go to my blog, qablog.practice.com. There's tons of information about communication and most of the other topics that we talked about today. And again, we invite you to be part of our next webinars. I believe that we're going to be having another one in about a month and a half or 2 months from now. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that you enjoyed this session. And again, hope to continue being in touch with you in the future. This is Joel from Practice signing off and saying thank you very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.